the witness who shouldn't have survived. The last thing I remember is the sound of the tent zipper opening itself. I woke up covered in blood and 3 dead friends around me. But to this day, no one believes what I saw that morning. The last thing I remember clearly from that night was the sound of the wind hitting the sides of the tent. It was a constant, almost comforting sound, as a reminder that we were isolated from the rest of the world, just the 4 of us and the darkness around Lake Bodom. We had spent the day swimming, laughing and drinking a little. Nothing exaggerated, just enough to make everything lighter. When we finally went to sleep, we were exhausted, crammed into a tent too small for 4 people. But out there was something beyond the wind, something that did not belong to that tranquility. I can't say exactly when I woke up, but I remember it was abrupt. Something was different. I felt the air heavy, as if the temperature had suddenly fallen. Then I heard the sound of the zipper. It was not a sudden or accidental movement, but a slow, deliberate slide. What froze me was that no one inside the tent was moving. For a second, I thought it was one of us, maybe going to the bathroom, but before I could react, something pulled the tarp. A tear, first a tense tissue sound, then the sound of something metallic piercing. My body seemed stuck. I was awake, but couldn't move a muscle. The next memories are fragmented, like flashes of a blinking light in the dark. What I saw first was a shadow, a figure that looked huge, but maybe it was my mind amplifying the fear. The moonlight gleam came through the tent and reflected something metallic. That's when I felt the first blow. Not on me, but somewhere nearby. The sound was moist and grotesque, like meat being crushed. The tent turned into chaos. I heard screams, but they sounded muffled, as if they came underwater. My eyes were fixed on that shadow and the red spot that was beginning to spread in the fabric of the tent. I don't know how, but at some point everything was quiet. When I opened my eyes again, I was outside, lying in the cold and wet earth. My body hurt in a way I had never felt before. There was blood everywhere, on my arms, on my legs, on my shirt. It was not just mine. When I turned my head, I saw the bodies of my friends. There was no way to confuse. They were dead. The tent was completely torn, destroyed. The silence around me was deafening. No sound of birds, wind, water. Only the echo of my panting breath and the metallic smell of blood. I tried to move, but the pain was unbearable. My jaw seemed dislocated, my face throbbing, and something hot ran off my forehead. The ground around me was covered with marks, as if someone had dragged objects or bodies. It was when my eyes fixed on something I could never forget: the shoes. They were about 10 meters away, neatly aligned, as if someone had put them there on purpose. One pair was mine. The other, I don't know. They didn't belong to any of us. It was as if someone was watching us, playing with the scene before it disappeared. I gathered forces to drag myself to a point where I could see more than was around. There was no sign of life. No steps, no figures among the trees. The feeling of being observed, however, was suffocating. It felt like at any moment something was going to pull me into the forest. The only thing I could do was to scream. For how long I don't know, but my voice was getting hoarse until a figure appeared in the distance. For a second, I thought it was me. But in fact, it was a man who ran past and froze to see me in that scene. He approached cautiously, probably trying to understand what he was seeing. His face was a mixture of horror and unbelief. He asked something, but I could not answer. My throat was dry, and the words seemed stuck. When I finally managed to mumble help, he took a step back, as if he was scared not only by the scene but also by me. I looked down and understood what. My body was covered in blood. Their blood. And to make matters worse, the axe we used to cut wood was on my side, stained. The authorities arrived some time later, but everything seemed a blur. They put me on a stretcher, whispered to each other, pointed at the tent, at the bodies. I could only face the sky, trying to convince myself that it was real. I vaguely remember a policeman leaning down next to me and asking what had happened. I tried to explain what I saw, the tent zipper moving, the silhouette of the blonde man dash, but I knew how it sounded, ridiculous, impossible. They looked at me as if I was crazy, or worse, as if I were to blame. And for a second I wondered if they weren't right. In the hospital, while they stitched the cuts to my face and immobilized my broken jaw, the flashes of memories came back as pieces of a macabre puzzle. The face of the aggressor, illuminated by the lantern that someone accidentally dropped on the ground. He did not look human. It was not by the face itself, but by the absence of any expression. It was as if he were empty, moving mechanically, but with a frightening precision. The sound of the axe crossing the tent canvas still echoed in my head, a dry noise that seemed to mark the beginning of the end. The questions started on the same day. They wanted to know who could have done it, and, more importantly, how I had survived. Every time I tried to tell what I saw, I felt the weight of skepticism in their eyes. "You're confused by the injuries," they said, but I knew what I had seen. The black and red outfit. The firm steps around the tent. They looked cold. They didn't want to hear, or maybe they couldn't believe it. What tormented me most, however, was the feeling that he knew exactly what he was doing, as if he had done it before, and would do it again. When I came home, everything seemed wrong. My parents tried to keep things normal, but I knew they were afraid of me. They didn't speak directly, but I could see it. It was the way my mother looked at me when she thought I wasn't seeing. As my father always had something to do in another room when I entered the room. In the village, people whispered, "Why did he survive? Is he to blame?" Even my best friends started avoiding contact with me. I didn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I would probably do the same. The nights were the worst. I had nightmares so intense that I woke up with the taste of blood in my mouth. Many times, I did not know if I was awake or still stuck in the dream. I heard footsteps outside my window more than once, but never had the courage to look. Always the same image came back to my mind, the face of the aggressor, immobile, without emotion. Like I had pleasure in what I was doing, but not the way we imagined. It was functional. It kept me asleep. The thought that he could be out there, waiting, planning, was suffocating. I never felt so alone. I tried to move on. I even went back to the crime scene once, which, thinking now, was a horrible decision. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe some answer, some explanation that would help me organize what happened that night. But all I found was an oppressive silence. The lake seemed much smaller than I remembered, almost claustrophobic. The trees around were still, but you could feel that there was something there. Something that did not want to be found. I stood still for a few minutes before feeling a wave of nausea and an almost instinctive urge to run away. It was as if the place itself was driving me away. After that, I started noticing strange things at home. Sounds in the middle of the night. Not the typical noises from an old house, but something more deliberate, as if someone was walking through the corridors. Once, I heard the sound of my backpack's zipper being opened on the floor of the room. Lit the light in an impulse, but there was nothing there except the open backpack with all my belongings scattered. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. It was the same feeling that night at the lake. That presence. You didn't leave me completely, not even after all. The night after that experience with the backpack, I decided to leave all the lights of my apartment on. It may sound childish, but I needed to feel safe somehow. It was then that I realized that no matter how much I tried to create a barrier of normality around me, it was determined to hit me. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, like plates being stirred. The sound was so distinct that it seemed impossible to ignore. Got up from the bed, my heart pounding, and went there. Nothing. All the dishes were exactly where I left them. But as soon as I turned to go out, I swear I saw something moving in the reflection of the window. Something fast, which should not be there. From that moment on, things only got worse. I started having dreams, or maybe more than that, of being back at the lake. In the dream, it was always dawn, and I saw my tent in the distance, but could not approach. Every time I tried, I heard that zipper sound opening, the same sound that woke me up that night. Only this time, I saw what was coming from inside. He was not human. He was a tall figure with shapeless contours, eyes that seemed to shine even in the darkness. I always woke up sweating cold, with the feeling that something was in the room watching me. These dreams began to take hold of me, to the point that I avoided sleeping, afraid of what I would see. After a few nights without sleeping, I decided to lock myself in the room with a camera pointed at me while I tried to rest. It was a way to maybe take some evidence, or even convince myself that I was just paranoid. The next morning, with eyes burning with exhaustion, I watched the recorded images. For almost 5 hours, the camera only captured silence, with the exception of some movements of mine in bed. But around 3:12 a.m., the video showed something that made me drop the notebook on the floor. A shadow slowly passed by the bed, obscuring part of the camera for a few seconds before disappearing. It was not the kind of shadow you could explain as a play of light. It was solid, too dark to be natural. The recording made me panic, but it also trapped me in a cycle of obsession. I kept recording the following nights, hoping to capture something else, or maybe convince myself that it was just a mistake. But things got worse. On the third night, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door as the camera recorded. I could not move, petrified of fear. The steps stopped, and then there was a low sound, almost as if someone was scratching the wood. When I finally created the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. Only the empty corridor, lit by the light that I had left on. The absolute silence was deafening. On the fourth night, something even more disturbing happened. The camera recorded a kind of noise that I had not noticed while sleeping, an irregular sound, as if someone was breathing heavily, but it was not my rhythm. In the video, I could see my own body motionless, but the sound continued, getting closer and sharper. For a moment it seemed to come from somewhere inside the room, but there was no one there. The worst part was that as the sound increased, the lights in the hallway outside the door started flashing, projecting uneven shadows into the room. The video ended abruptly when the camera fell to the ground, without me understanding how. It was that night I realized I could not stay at home anymore. Took some clothes and went straight to the car, decided to spend the night at a friend's house. Before I left, however, I had to fetch something in the corridor. When I opened the door of the room, I felt a strong smell of wet earth and rust. The air seemed heavier, as if the house itself was trying to hold me there. The corridor, which should be empty, had something different. Don't know how to explain, but the shadows on the walls seemed longer than usual, even without any light source that would justify it. It was as if I was being watched by something that knew I was running away. I left home that night certain that something was with me. In the car, while driving through the deserted streets, the smell of wet dirt and rust seemed to permeate my nose, even with the windows closed. Looked in the rear view mirror every minute, feeling as if something was sitting in the back seat. The silence was almost unbearable, so I turned on the radio to try to distract my mind. But as soon as the sound started, it was replaced by static. In the middle of the noise, something formed, a low, almost imperceptible voice that whispered my name repeatedly. I turned off the radio immediately, my hands shaking on the wheel. I arrived at my friend's house around 3 o'clock in the morning. I rang the bell urgently, even though I knew he could be sleeping. When he opened the door, the expression on his face made it clear that I didn't look well. I quickly explained what was happening and asked to spend the night there. He, somewhat suspicious, agreed. Sitting on the sofa in the living room, I tried to relax, but my mind kept revisiting the events. It was then that I noticed something strange. In the corner of the ceiling, just above the television, there was a dark mark that looked like a shadow. It wasn't there before. As much as I tried to convince myself that it was only my imagination, the feeling of being observed came back with full force. My friend noticed my gaze fixed on the corner of the ceiling and asked what was wrong. I could only point, without being able to say anything. He looked up and at first laughed, saying it was just a seepage stain. But then he stopped, got serious, and took a step back. The strain seemed to grow, slowly, extending as if something was running into the wall. We both were paralyzed, and the air in the room seemed to have become denser, almost impossible to breathe. It was when we heard a strange sound, like a muffled whisper coming from inside the walls. My friend turned on the light, but that only made things more strange. The stain was no longer on the ceiling. It now appeared on the floor between us. Don't know what made us standing there looking at it. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was pure morbid curiosity. But then the stain began to take shape. In the middle of it, small bright spots appeared like eyes. And there was something else, a sort of deformed human figure, writhing in the middle of that darkness. It was only when a sound like a groan began to echo through the room that my panic reaction dominated me. I yelled to get out of there, but my friend seemed frozen, staring at it as if he was in a trance. I tried to pull my friend by the arm, but he was stiff, as if every muscle of his body was locked. It was then that he began to murmur something, almost inaudible, while his eyes were fixed on the figure on the ground. He's saying something, is talking to me. He whispered, but his voice sounded strange, almost unrecognizable, as if it was muffled by some kind of echo. It was then that the figure began to move, not as a human being. It was more like a shadow crawling, but not on the ground. It moved in an unnatural plane, as if ignoring gravity. The sound became louder, almost a cry or a plea, but it did not come from the figure. It came from inside the walls, as if the whole house was alive. At that moment, the panic hit me hard. I shouted my friend's name and pushed him so hard that he finally fell to the ground, as if he had come out of a trance. He seemed confused, but enough to realize what was happening. Without saying a word, we ran to the door, but the feeling of being observed became even stronger. It seemed like the whole house was watching us. When I looked back by reflection, the figure was still there, but now he smiled. We got to the door, but when I tried to turn the handle, it didn't move. It was as if it was welded in place. My friend started to hit her with all his strength, shouting for someone outside to help us. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the walls, as if we were stuck in some kind of vacuum. And then out of nowhere, the figure appeared closer, right in the center of the room. But it was no longer a shadow. It seemed something tangible, Its contours were irregular, like a human body, but deformed in a way that defies any logical description. I felt my breath fail. My chest was tight, and my heart seemed to explode at any moment. My friend turned to face the thing, and, at the moment his eyes met those of that figure, he began to scream in a way I will never forget. It was a primitive scream of pure terror. I tried to pull him away, but he didn't move. He seemed hypnotized. The figure approached slowly. Each step of it made a sound that was at once wet and dry, as if something was being torn from the inside out. It was then that the figure extended an arm, or something like an arm, towards my friend. Without thinking twice, I pushed him, breaking the eye contact that seemed to keep him trapped. He fell to the ground, and in that brief moment, I took advantage of it to pull him and run towards the window. With no alternatives, I took a heavy vessel that was nearby and threw against the glass, which shattered with a bang. The cold night air invaded the room, bringing a momentary feeling of relief. I helped my friend to get up, and together we jumped through the opening, falling into the garden outside. Without looking back, we ran as fast as we could. Each step seemed a Herculean effort, but fear drove us. We only stopped to breathe when we were already several blocks away. Finally, we leaned against a wall, trying to catch our breath. My friend trembled uncontrollably, his eyes wide open. "What was that?" he managed to murmur. I had no answer. To this day, I can't explain exactly what happened that night. Nobody believed us, of course, but since then, that feeling of being watched never left me. And the worst part is knowing that, wherever I go, this thing is always one step behind, waiting. The man in red and black. He was standing there, among the trees, watching us. When we realized that he was moving towards us, it was too late. If you think terror ends at dawn, you need to hear what happened at Lake Bodom. I have never been one to believe in horror stories or local legends, but Lake Bodom has always had a strange aura. When my friends suggested camping there, I laughed at the idea that something could go wrong. It was a quiet summer night, with the sky clear and the sound of trees swaying in the wind. We pitched our tent near the lake shore, where the water reflected the stars, and began to drink and talk. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something strange in the forest, just beyond the reach of our fire. A figure stood among the trees, tall, motionless, with something shining in its black and red clothes. My first instinct was to ignore, but the discomfort was impossible to ignore. I tried to point the figure to my friends, but they did not give much importance. One of them joked that maybe it was the famous man from the kiosk, a story they used to tell about an old weirdo who hated campers. I laughed together, trying to relieve the tension, but that figure was still there, motionless. Every time I looked, it seemed that he was closer, although he had never seen any movement. When I finally mustered the courage to take the lantern and light the place where he was, the emptiness that I found was worse than seeing him there. There were only trees, but the sound that came soon after, a heavy noise of wood hitting something from the bottom of the forest, made my heart go up. After the sound, we all stood in silence for a few seconds, trying to understand what it was. One of my friends suggested that maybe they were animals, but it didn't seem like it. It was as if someone was hitting hard against a log or something like that. We decided to build the fire, a silly attempt to feel safer. Only that, while we collected branches near the tent, I felt like I was being watched again. It was a suffocating sensation, as if something or someone were very close but out of sight. When I returned to the circle of light, I realized that the figure had returned. He was even closer, at the edge of the clearing, standing in the same place, but this time it seemed to face us directly. This time, no one thought it was a joke. The silence between us was absolute, interrupted only by the crackling of the burning wood. One of my friends picked up a kitchen knife we had brought, while another started screaming for the figure to come out. But she didn't move. It was not just the fact of standing there that scared me, but the way the dark forest seemed to swallow him. It was as if the darkness around him were denser, almost alive. Suddenly, a branch broke close to us, and when we looked back, the figure had simply disappeared. I wanted to believe he was gone, but deep down I knew the real terror was just beginning. We tried to continue the night as if nothing had happened, but the mood changed completely. The sound of the forest, before full of crickets and leaves creaking, seemed to have disappeared. It was an oppressive, heavy silence, as if something was holding the air around us. We stood near the fire, but nobody talked much. It was then that we heard footsteps. They were not light as those of an animal, but heavy, almost deliberate, circling our tent. What made my blood cold was realizing that the sound didn't come from just one direction. It was different steps, as if we were surrounded. One of my friends started screaming that we were going to call the police, even without a cell phone signal. That's when our fire just went out. I know it sounds absurd, but the fire died at once, as if someone had thrown a bucket of water on it. We were in the dark, only with the reflection of the flashlight that someone managed to connect in a hurry. In the beam of light, we saw footprints on the ground, fresh around the tent, but no one was there. We decided to go into the tent and lock the zipper, as if that would protect us. We all huddled, listening to the steps that now seemed closer. The sound of the zipper was what made me almost faint. He began to open slowly from the outside in, even with all of us inside. It was there that we saw, through a crack, the black boots with splashes of something dark and the reflection of the bright red of his clothes. The zipper kept opening, but no one had the courage to move. We were all frozen, holding our breaths as if it could make us invisible. His face never fully appeared, only the brightness of a crooked smile lit by the reflection of the lantern that had fallen to the ground. I felt my heart beating so hard that I thought it would explode. When it seemed that he was about to enter, one of my friends cried out in pure despair. The sound echoed through the tent, and it was as if he had triggered something. The boots took 2 steps back, and then silence. Total, absolute, as if the world itself had stopped. But what came next was even worse, a low, hoarse laugh, so close that it seemed to be inside our head. After that, I can't explain exactly how we got out of there. At some point, we ran to the car, stumbling in the dark, leaving almost everything behind. While driving, we still heard fast steps behind us, as if he was following us until the last second. When we finally got to the main road, nobody said anything, not even when we came home. The next day, we tried to tell the police, but all we got were skeptical looks. Nothing we described seemed possible, and the footprints around the camp, erased as if they had never existed. To this day, no one believes what happened that night. But I know what I saw, and what I heard, and I know that somehow that man, or whatever it was, is still there waiting. The KGB spy and his secrets. It was supposed to be a simple bird-watching trip, but that morning I saw something I could never tell anyone, until now. If I had known what would happen, I never would have looked through binoculars. I've always been a bit skeptical. Stories of crimes and conspiracies never impressed me, but that changed completely after a trip to Lake Bodom. I had just joined a bird-watching group, and the idea was to spend a quiet weekend outdoors. The morning we arrived, the air was cold, but the sky was clear, and the lake had that perfect reflection like a mirror. The group spread out along the shore, each with his binoculars and notebooks. It was such a peaceful place that it was hard to imagine what had happened there so many years ago. The massacre which, for many, is still a mystery. Just before noon, while adjusting the focus of my binoculars to observe a flock of wild geese, I noticed something strange in the distance on the other side of the lake. Initially, I thought it was another bird watcher, but soon realized that the figure was still, almost like a statue. What made me most uneasy was the fact that even from a distance, it looked like he was looking directly at me. There was something wrong. The posture, the way he seemed not to blink, and especially the feeling, it was as if he knew I was there. I dropped the binoculars and turned to call the others, but when I looked back, he was gone. Okay. The rest of the group seemed too busy to care for what I was saying. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I decided to let it go, but that feeling didn't pass. I decided to walk to the place where I had seen the man, just to prove to myself that it was my head. Crossing the terrain was harder than I thought. The edge was full of exposed roots and slippery rocks. When I finally got to the point where it was, I only found crumpled grass, as if someone had actually been standing there for a while. The detail that made me shiver was a strange smell, almost metallic, coming from the ground. It was like dry blood. Came back quickly to the group, but did not say anything this time. The afternoon passed without major events, but I could not relax. Every little sound, leaves moving or branches breaking, seemed amplified. When the sun started to set, the group decided to end their activities. While we were guarding our equipment, a man appeared on the next track. He wore an old coat and was with a short, almost military haircut. His eyes passed through us all, but took longer on me, as if he recognized me. I tried to pretend I didn't notice, but my heart popped. It was him. I was sure. Okay. At that moment, everything inside me screamed for me to not look at him anymore, but it was impossible to ignore. The man stood still, just watching, without saying a word. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, he turned and started walking into the forest. But the way he moved was strange. It was not a natural step. It was as if he was fighting something or carrying an invisible weight. I turned to the group, hoping that someone else had noticed, but no one seemed upset. It was as if he was invisible to everyone but me. I decided to go towards the car to put my gear away and get away from that oppressive feeling. On the way, I heard footsteps behind me. They were not fast, but heavy and firm. When I turned, there was no one. It was as if the sound was coming from all directions. I ran to the car and stood inside, trying to control my breathing. The group finally appeared minutes later, laughing and talking, while I was there sweating cold. When I told them what had happened, they looked at me as if I was delirious. And honestly, at that point I wasn't sure if I was or not. Okay. At night, back at the cabin where we were staying, I tried to forget what had happened. But there was something wrong there too. I could feel it. A strange silence took over the place. Even with the group laughing and talking, it was as if there was an additional presence in the room, something you couldn't see but knew was there. At one point, I went to the window to breathe a little fresh air, and in the reflection of the glass, I swear I saw someone standing on the edge of the forest outside. It was just a shadow, but the outline looked familiar. I turned quickly, but there was no one. Only the trees swaying with the wind. That night, the dreams came. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if I was stuck in that moment of the day in the clearing. The sound of footsteps behind me, the shadow in the forest, everything was there but amplified. I woke up several times sweating, feeling as if someone was in the room with me. When I finally got to sleep, I woke up on the floor near the door, as if I had been walking during the night. What's the scariest detail? My hands were covered with dirt, with the nails almost black, just like those of that man in the hospital in the account about Hans Assmann. I never could explain that. I have never been able to sleep right since. The screams never found. Everyone says the lake is cursed, but I thought it was just a legend. Until I heard the screams in the distance that night. They came from the wrong direction, where there should be no one. I have always been fascinated by stories of cursed places. Those legends that everyone knows in the small town, but no one really cares to check. When I heard about Bodom Lake, I thought it was just another one of those tales. A remote place, surrounded by twisted trees and legends of mysterious deaths. My friends always said it was bullshit, but something in the way the locals talked about the lake made me uneasy. It was not just fear or superstition. It was as if they had seen something they would rather forget. I decided to go alone. I thought spending a few hours there at night would be an interesting adventure, maybe even funny. Now, I can't remember that decision without feeling my stomach turn. I arrived at the lake at dusk. The road there was bumpy, surrounded by high bushes that seemed to close behind the car. When I got out of the vehicle, the silence was absolute, but not the kind of comfortable silence. It was a heavy silence, as if the air were thick. The lake looked dead, without even the sound of frogs or insects. The trees around it were different from any I had ever seen. His branches were crooked, as if they were trying to run away from there, but could not. I set up a small fire near the shore, more to feel safe than for the cold. The light of fire danced in the trees, and it was then that I noticed something strange. The shadows did not seem to move in the right way. But I thought it was just my head playing tricks. I was trying to ignore the feeling of discomfort, but something in the air seemed wrong. I can't explain it right, but it was as if I was being watched. At first I thought they were animals in the forest, but the sounds came from a specific place, the opposite direction to the lake, where there were no trails or houses. A slight sound began to appear, almost imperceptible, as if the wind carried voices very far away. I laughed at myself, trying to drive away the fear. But then that sound changed. It became louder, lighter. They were cries, long, distressing, but with a strange thing. They didn't seem normal. There was something inhuman, as if they were dragged, distorted. My chest became tight, and for a moment I considered getting into the car and going away. But the curious in me won. I took the flashlight and decided to go to the shore. The screams seemed to get more intense as I approached the water. They echoed from an impossible point, the middle of the lake. I was paralyzed, trying to understand. There were no boats, no signs of people around. Nothing but that dark water, still as a mirror, lit with the flashlight, hoping to see something, anything that would explain it. That's when I saw, right on the surface of the water, almost imperceptible, something was moving. At first, I thought they were leaves or reflections of my beam of light, but it was something more dense, more defined. It looked like a figure submerged, but floating a few centimeters from the surface. Tried to focus more with the flashlight, but at that exact moment the screams stopped. Everything was absurdly quiet, as if the lake had sucked the sound. I couldn't look away from that in the water. My flashlight was shaking in my hand, but I don't know if it was because of the cold or the growing dread that took care of me. The figure seemed static, but at the same time pulsed, as if it was alive. It was hard to tell, but there was something deeply wrong with its shape. It was neither human nor animal. Just a silhouette impossible to describe. That's when the noise came back, but this time there were no screams. It was something lower, like a moan coming directly from the water. My instincts were screaming for me to run, but my legs seemed to be stuck on the ground. Then the surface of the lake began to move. Not slowly, like the movement of waves, but abruptly, as if something was trying to emerge. I took a step back, almost stumbling on an exposed root, when I realized that the shadows around me had also changed. It was no longer just the trees. Something else was casting shadows around me, but I could not identify the source. It was at that moment I felt a presence behind me. I did not hear footsteps, nor did I feel the ground vibrate. I just knew there was something there. The kind of certainty that shivers your spine and makes your mind freeze. I tried to turn slowly, but as I did this, I saw by eye corner a very high shadow disproportionate between the trees. She seemed to move like smoke, but had a shape that made it seem as if she was looking directly at me. I didn't know what to do. Every fiber of my body was screaming to run, but I was stuck at that moment, as if time had stopped. The shadow in between the trees seemed to grow, becoming denser, more solid. The air around me became so heavy that it seemed difficult to breathe. That's when I realized the sounds around me had disappeared again. Not only the cries, but everything, the wind, the leaves, even the sound of my heart seemed muffled. It was as if the whole world had been swallowed by that silence. Then suddenly the shadow moved. Not fast, but fluidly, almost as if it were floating. It didn't come directly to me. It went into the water, as if being attracted by something in the lake. When the shadow reached the shore, I heard a sound that I will never forget. A high burst like glass breaking, but coming from inside my head. My eyes were closed instinctively, and when I opened them again, the thing that I had seen in the water was now on the shore. Only it was no longer submerged. It had form, but it was not something I could describe in words. It was as if it were constantly changing, defying any logic. And then the screams started again, but this time they didn't come from far away. They were all around me, inside me. Fell to my knees, clasping hands against my ears, but it didn't matter. It was as if the screams were part of the place, part of me. It was at that moment I realized that if I didn't leave, I would never leave. Gathering every gram of strength I had left, I stood up and started running. I didn't look back, because something inside me knew that if I saw it again, I would never be the same person again. My lantern swung wildly, but the light seemed useless. The shadows around me were no longer just part of the night. They had life, movement. The sound of the screams mixed with a kind of low hum, as if something huge was approaching. Each step seemed to push me further away from the car, even though I was sure that I was going in the right direction. The ground under my feet was strange, as if the ground was pulsating alive. I do not know how long I ran, but finally saw the car in the distance. It was like a miracle, but my relief lasted only for a short time. When I got to the car door, I noticed something that made me hesitate. The window was blurred inside, as if someone had been there breathing. My heart almost stopped. I tried to ignore it, went in and slammed the door, turning the key with my shaky hands. The engine started, but as I was speeding down the road back, a horrible feeling took over me. In the rearview mirror, something moved. A shadow, or perhaps the thing I had seen in the lake. I don't know, because I didn't have the courage to look again. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, but the silence of my house did not bring comfort. Even today, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the impression of hearing the same cries echoing inside my head. Don't know what it was, but I know I left something in Lake Bodom. Or maybe something from the lake came with me. The tent that never stood. The tent was found collapsing, but when we arrived at the site, it was whole again. No one believed me when I told them what I saw around her. Or rather, what should not be there. I have always been skeptical about these stories of cursed camps. For me, they were just exaggerations or attempts to scare tourists. But when my cousin called me to explore a place where a famous crime had happened decades ago, I confess that I was intrigued. It was an old camp in a secluded area, and the case had never been solved. Some people said that the place still had strange energy, as if things there had never really ended. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go. It was winter, the place was deserted, and it seemed the perfect time to explore. We arrived at dusk, and the atmosphere was already heavy, but nothing that I could not attribute to the cold and isolation. Or at least that's what I thought. We set up our tent near the site of the old camp. I can't say exactly why, but the area seemed wrong. It was not obvious, but it was as if everything around was too quiet. Neither the sound of wind nor birds. Just absolute silence. When we were arranging our things, I noticed something curious. The land around our tent looked different. It was darker, as if constantly wet, but there was no sign of water nearby. My cousin commented that maybe it was just the soil of the region, but when we stayed in the tent stakes, they were not firm. Each time we held them, they would come loose again, as if something pushed them out. At first we laughed, only that the discomfort was growing as the night fell. It was already night when we finally managed to make the tent stand. It wasn't perfect, but it was firm enough. We sat around the fire and tried to relax, but that feeling of being watched did not leave me alone. My cousin was also strange, quieter than usual. At one point, he said that he thought he saw something moving among the trees, but when we looked with the lantern, there was nothing. The flame of the fire seemed smaller than it should, almost as if the surrounding air was sucking its energy. It was when we noticed something else. The floor was dry where we were sitting, but near the tent, the ground looked even darker and brighter, as if it had become wet again. It didn't make sense, because there had been no rain or signs of water nearby. Shortly after, we heard a low sound, almost like a snap coming from the direction of the tent. I stood up slowly, lighting with the lantern, and saw something that made my blood cold. The tent, which we had fought so hard to keep standing, had completely collapsed, as if someone or something had pulled the stakes on purpose. But the strangest thing was what happened next. As my cousin and I approached to check, carefully stepping on the dark ground, the tent began to rise alone, as if being assembled again, but without anyone touching it. It was not fast, but it was impossible not to notice. The clothes stretched, the stakes seemed to come back into place, and soon she was whole again, as if she had never fallen. I stood still, holding the lantern with trembling hands, unable to believe what I was seeing. We stood there, frozen, staring at the tent. My cousin tried to say something, but his voice came out low, almost like a whisper. I was in shock, but still tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was the wind, some movement of the ground, any explanation that did not involve what my mind was beginning to consider. We decided to check, even with the overwhelming feeling that something didn't want us to approach. As we got closer, the smell changed. It was something metallic, mixed with wet earth, and suddenly I started feeling nauseous. We opened the tent zipper slowly, and inside it looked exactly as we had left it. But there was something that wasn't there before, marks on the ground like small scratches or scrapes, going towards the middle of the tent where our backpacks were. My cousin started to go through the backpacks, trying to see if something had been stolen or tampered with, but that's when we noticed that one thing was missing: the camera. He had brought an old camera, those that still use film, because he wanted to take pictures of the place. We were sure she was there when we set up camp. We turned everything around, but the camera had simply disappeared. There were no footprints around, nothing to indicate that anyone was there. Only the feeling of being observed became stronger and stronger. We decided to leave the tent and go back to near the fire, but as soon as we left, the silence around us became deeper. No sound, no wind. Only the fire, which seemed to be extinguishing, even with new wood. While we tried to rekindle the fire, we heard another sound coming from the tent. This time, it was something more defined, as if someone was dragging something heavy inside her. My heart shot, and we looked at each other without knowing what to do. My cousin took the flashlight and, hesitating, lit the tent again. But what we saw this time was much worse. The tent completely collapsed again, but now it looked deformed. The cloths were stretched inward, as if something had pulled them. It was as if the tent was being swallowed up from inside, and the sound of scratches continued. My cousin took 2 steps back and started babbling that we needed to get out of there. I couldn't move. It was as if the surrounding air were heavier, holding me in place. It was at this moment that something crossed my peripheral vision. Do not know exactly what it was, but it seemed a rapid movement between the trees, something high and without defined form. When I looked directly, there was nothing there, only shadows, but the feeling of being surrounded was unbearable. I decided we could not wait any longer. I took my cousin's arm and started to pull him towards the car. As we ran, the sound behind us became more intense. It was no longer just the tent or the scratches. It was like an echo of heavy steps mixed with a low, almost electronic hum that seemed to vibrate in our bones. When we finally got to the car, we locked the doors and started the engine. But as we lit up the place with the headlights, we saw the tent again. It was kept intact, as if nothing had happened. As the car sped back up the track, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. There was something deeply wrong with the way the tent looked so perfect, so normal after all we saw. My cousin was also silent, eyes fixed on the road, hands shaking at the wheel. The road seemed longer than it should, as if we were never going to leave that area. And then came the worst. The buzz we had heard before started again, but this time it was inside the car. It was not loud, but it was so present that it was impossible to ignore. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of panic. I tried to talk to my cousin, but he just stared at me for a second, pale, before staring back at the road. When we finally reached the main road, the hum stopped. He didn't say a word as he drove to my house. I got out of the car as fast as I could, and that night I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched followed me until the next day. Later, my cousin called me, saying he found the camera in the trunk of his car, which was impossible since we didn't even get to put it there. When he revealed the film, all the photos were of us both, but taken from angles that no one could have done. Some showed the tent from a distance, others seemed to be in the middle of the forest, as if someone was watching us all the time. We never went back to that place, But even today I wonder what was around us that night, and how something like this can exist without anyone being able to explain. The collector of keys. It was just a joke, you know. Who loses the keys for the next round? That's what we said that night. But when we found the missing keys on the lakeshore, it was too late. It all started as a stupid joke, the kind you make up when you're having fun with friends and don't want the day to end. We were five, me, my older brother, two of his friends, and my best friend, Clara. We spent all day on the lake, laughing, talking, and making stupid challenges. It was my brother who suggested the game of keys. Whoever loses the keys for the next round. Basically, we threw our keys in a circle, and those who did not find them on time had to pay some challenge. The lake was quiet, almost deserted, and the idea that something could go wrong did not pass by our head. It seemed just another ordinary summer day, of those you remember fondly years later. But now, I can't think about it without feeling a lump in my stomach. The afternoon began to turn to night, and the game became more intense. We threw the keys farther and farther away, laughing as if nothing mattered. It was only when it was already dark that something strange happened. Clara threw her keys, and we all saw where they fell, near a tree by the lake. But when we went to look, they were simply gone. We swept the ground, looked through the roots of the tree, and even into the shallow water near the shore. Nothing. We joked that Clara was just trying to get away from a challenge, but she seemed really upset. My brother suggested that perhaps some animal would be taken, but we all knew it didn't make sense. It was then that we noticed something else. The lake, before so serene, was completely still, as if time had frozen. While we were looking for the keys to Clara, I realized that the atmosphere had changed. The air seemed heavier, as if something invisible was pressing our breasts. The silence was absolute. Neither the sounds of trees or water were there to accompany us. It was then that my friend Lucas, one of the most skeptical of the group, shouted, "I found." We ran to him, who was on the lake's edge, but what he held were not Clara's keys. It was a rusty set of keys, clearly old. It looked like something that had been left there for decades. Luke tried to laugh, saying that maybe it was from some fisherman, but no one answered. We all looked at those keys, not understanding how they had stopped there. More disturbing still was the fact that, around them, there were marks on the ground, like little grooves, which looked like traces of something that had passed, dragging. We decided it was time to go. It was already dark, and that feeling of something wrong only increased. We got our things quickly, but that's when we realized it wasn't just us. Clara was pale, holding my brother's arm, pointing to the lake. When I looked, I felt my stomach turn. There was something there, a shadow, or perhaps a figure, standing right on the line where water meets land. It had no face, no definite shape, but it was there, immobile. We stood still for a few seconds that seemed hours, until the figure simply disappeared, as if it had been sucked into the lake. Nobody said a word. We just ran to the car, but when we got there, we realized something was wrong. The keys of all of us had gone. Despair took over. We turned our backpacks, our pockets, even the floor around the car, but the keys were just nowhere. What made me even more uneasy was to realize that the keys of Clara, the first ones that disappeared, were the only ones that had already disappeared before we arrived at the car. It was as if something was playing with us, always one step ahead. My brother suggested that we go back to the lake to look, but no one had the courage to say aloud what everyone was thinking. What we saw on the lake's edge was not something we wanted to cross again. Even so, with no other choice, We took our lanterns and started to go back on the trail. Each step seemed harder, as if the ground itself wanted to hold us. When we arrived at the lake, everything was too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears buzz because it is completely unnatural. Lucas saw it first. On the ground, where we had seen that figure before, there was a pile of keys. Not only ours, but many others. Some looked new, shining in the beam of the lantern, while others were covered with rust, like those that Lucas had found before. Clara started crying softly, and I felt my chest squeeze in a way that I had never felt before. My brother stepped forward to get the keys, but stopped halfway. On the other side of the lake, something started to emerge from the water. It was not fast, but the feeling that it was looking at us was unbearable. We leave the keys there and run as if our lives depend on it. We got to the car breathlessly, and no one could say a word. My brother tried to open the door with force, even knowing we did not have the keys. Panic was absolute. It was when Luke, with his hands shaking, looked back and whispered something I could not understand. I came to see what it was, and there it was, the same figure. No longer on the edge, but in the middle of the track, standing still, with that suffocating presence that seemed to make the air heavier. Only now, with the lanterns pointed at her, I realized something that I had not noticed before. There was something in her hands. It was as if I was holding something that glittered faintly. And then I realized. No one waited to see what would happen next. We ran along the trail, stumbling over branches and rocks, until we reached the main road. It was there that we finally stopped, panting, looking at each other without understanding anything. When I looked back for the last time, the trail was empty. No figure, no key, just the same overwhelming silence that now seemed to follow us. My brother managed to start the car with a knife that carried, and drove without stopping until we got home. To this day, we never talked about what happened that night. We don't know what the thing was, or why the keys were so important to it. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel the weight of a set of keys in my pocket even when he's not there. The clock stopped at 3:16. All the clocks stopped exactly at the same minute. We woke up to footsteps, but there was no one around, at least no one alive. Always found these stories of haunted lakes an exaggeration, but that night, I had reason to reconsider. Me and my friend Renato decided to camp near the lake that the residents avoid mentioning by name. He was always fascinated by horror stories and wanted to prove that they were only legends. We arrived at the site around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The place was beautiful, with tall trees and a light breeze that made the water look like a mirror. There was no sign of other people, which was strange, since the lake was on a popular trail point. Although I felt something that I could not explain, as if the place did not want us there, I ignored it. Set up the tent, helped Renato to light the fire, and we laughed at the stories he had researched about the massacre in the lake. It was almost midnight when the weather began to change. The wind stopped suddenly, and silence took over. It was not just the lack of noise. It was as if the sound had been erased. Even the crackling of the fire seemed distant. Renato started to joke that it was the anniversary of the massacre, and that the spirits were coming to collect bills. I laughed, but I was uncomfortable. To make matters worse, the clocks, both his and mine, stopped at exactly 3:16. I thought it was a coincidence, battery running out, or any logical explanation. But then we heard the steps. They were slow, heavy, and came from the direction of the lake. We pointed at the lanterns, but there was nothing. Nothing but still water and a thin mist that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Renato tried to act as if he was not scared, but I saw that he was tense. He kept calling for the supposed visitor, shouting things like, "Who's there? Show up." I wanted him to stop. Something about those steps didn't seem normal. They weren't random sounds. There was a rhythm in them, as if it were a deliberate walk. But at the same time, they did not approach or move away. They stood there around, in the same spot between water and land. I decided to approach the lake with the lantern, against all my instincts. As I got closer, the ground became strange. It was not clay or sand, but something wet and cold, sticking to my shoes as if he wanted to pull me. The mist was thicker now, and you could barely see the surface of the water. Then I saw something that made me freeze. On the shore, where it was empty before, there were footprints. They were not normal. They were deep, wider than a human foot, and seemed to be facing the lake, as if something had come out of the water and walked into the forest. I called Renato, but when he arrived, the footprints were already disappearing, as if the ground was swallowing them. He tried to make fun of my reaction, saying it was probably just the unstable terrain, but I knew he was as uncomfortable as I was. We went back to the fire, but something was wrong with it too. The flames were smaller, almost extinguishing even with dry wood. The smell around changed, becoming metallic, like blood. And the steps, they did not stop. Now they seemed to be even closer. Sitting by the fire, we were silent for a while, trying to ignore the steps that seemed to circulate around us. The air was so heavy that it seemed difficult to breathe, and I began to feel a strange cold, despite the heat of the fire. Renato tried to touch the phone, perhaps looking for some distraction, but the screen was locked, as if the device had simply given up working. I looked at my clock and felt a shiver. 3:16. Could not take my eyes off those frozen hours, as if time itself had decided to stop there. That's when the noise changed. It was no more steps, but something dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled by the earth. The sound came from the opposite side of the lake, into the forest, and I felt the courage to abandon me. Renato, perhaps wanting to prove something to himself, took the flashlight and started walking towards the sound. I begged him to stop, but he kept on saying that he needed to see what it was. I was paralyzed, watching the light of the lantern disappear as he walked away. The sound of the drag became louder, more intense, until it suddenly stopped. An absolute silence took over the place, so deep that it seemed impossible. I called Renato, but did not get any answer. Then his lantern reappeared in the mist, falling to the ground with a dry thud. I ran towards the light, heart pounding, but there was no sign of him. Only the fallen lantern and, next to it, marks on the ground that seemed to form a perfect circle, as if something was delimiting that space. I could barely breathe as I looked at that circle on the floor. The marks were deep and seemed to be made with an absurd precision, as if they had been engraved there by something beyond human. I took Renato's flashlight, pointing it everywhere, but there was no sign of him. I called his name several times, my voice trembling, but the only answer I received was silence. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but it was not comforting. On the contrary, it seemed that the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I decided to run back to the fire, but when I turned around, I saw something I will never forget. There was a figure standing near the tent. There was no trace or detail to distinguish, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb all the light around. Frozen in place, I watched as the figure leaned slowly, almost as if he was looking at something on the ground. My instinct told me not to move, but fear took hold, and I started to take steps backwards. At that moment, the figure raised his head and turned towards me. It had no face. It was just a void, but I felt that I was being looked at, as if it were seeing me from the inside. Without thinking, I turned and ran towards the car. I didn't care about the things I left behind. When I arrived at the main track, I noticed that the clock of the flashlight still marked 3h16. It was as if I had not come out of that moment, as if time was stuck with me in that nightmare. I arrived at the car completely breathless and with the feeling that something was following me. The key was already in contact, something I never do, but that night seemed to be a stroke of luck. Went in, slammed the door and turned on the engine, but I hesitated for a second, looking at the track. Renato was still there somewhere. My mind cried to come back and look for him, but my body just couldn't move. It was then that I saw something coming from the track. It wasn't Renato. The same faceless figure was standing on the roadside, a few meters from me, motionless. I can't explain, but at that moment I was sure that if I didn't leave there, I wouldn't survive to tell what happened. I stepped on the accelerator and only stopped when I was miles away from the lake. I spent hours in the car, shaking, trying to decide what to do. I called the police and explained the disappearance of Renato, but of course I did not mention the figure or the steps. They searched the place, but found nothing but our fire extinguished, the tent dismantled, and the marks on the ground. Renato's watch, which was lying near the lantern, also marked 3h16. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. I have heard many theories, from an animal attack to more dark things. But what I saw that night cannot be explained. I never went back to the lake, but sometimes in the silence of the morning, I still hear that sound of steps, always stopping at 3:16. Blood, shoes, and silence. I was told never to go back to the lake, but I needed to know what happened. Just didn't expect to find the bloody shoes, exactly where they said nothing was found before. I always heard the stories about Lake Bodom as I grew up. Everyone in town had an opinion about what really happened that night in the 60s, but nobody knew for sure. When they started accusing Nils Gustafsson, I was too young to understand, but I remember the commotion. Some thought he was guilty. Others said he was just another victim. For me, that was just a local urban legend until the day I found an old diary at my grandparents' house years later. My grandmother always said never to touch the things in the basement, but I was curious. The diary belonged to a man who had worked in the first search team after the massacre. It was reading those pages that I began to question everything I thought I knew. The diary entries were confused and full of scratches, but one thing caught my attention. He mentioned bloody shoes that were never officially found. At the time, I thought it was just a detail lost in the confusion of the case, but something about the way he described it bothered me. He said the shoes were in a place where none of the bodies should have been. This phrase was hammering in my head for weeks, until I finally decided to go to the lake alone. It was a stupid idea, but I needed to see the place with my own eyes. When I told my grandmother, she looked at me as if I had gone mad and said only one thing: "Don't come back after dark. They don't like to be remembered." I arrived at the lake in the middle of the afternoon, with the sun still high, trying to keep calm. Although the scenery is beautiful, there was something strange in the atmosphere. The surrounding trees seemed to lean forward, as if they were trying to hide what was beyond them. The silence was what bothered me most. There were no birds or insects, only the muffled sound of my footsteps on the trail. When I finally reached the shore, I felt a chill, The lake was perfectly calm, but it seemed wrong. It was not the kind of place you want to spend a lot of time. I decided to start looking for the area that the diary mentioned, near a group of trees tilted towards the water. As I walked, I had the strange feeling that someone was watching me, but there was no one there. After some time, I found an area where the soil was more wet, almost soaked, although it had not rained in the last few days. It was then that I saw something that made me stop at the same instant. In the middle of the clay, there was a shoe. It was an old model, clearly from another time, and was partially buried. I bent down to look closer and noticed that there were dark spots on the side, spots that looked like dry blood. My heart popped. Took the shoe carefully, trying to understand how it could be there after so long. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. Next to him, there were another pair of footprints, small and sharp, as if someone had walked up there recently. But the strange thing is that they ended suddenly, disappearing towards the lake. Held the shoe in my hands for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. My heart was beating so fast I could hear in the oppressive silence around. It didn't make sense. How could something so old be there, practically intact? And those footprints? I stared at them, hoping to find some logical explanation, but could only think that something or someone had left it recently. I decided to put the shoe in my backpack and go back to the trail, but before I left, something caught my attention. A sound. It was weak, almost a whisper, coming from the direction of the lake. I was paralyzed, trying to identify, but it was impossible to understand what he said. It seemed a mixture of words in another language, interspersed with something that sounded like muted laughter. Against all my instincts, I approached the shore to try to see better. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. That's when I saw a shadow moving beneath the surface. It was large but undefined, as if it had no concrete form. I took a step back, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the sound increased. Now it was no longer just a whisper. It was like a cacophony of voices, all speaking at the same time, without meaning. Then, out of nowhere, the water shook violently, as if something had emerged, but there was nothing visible. The noise stopped so suddenly when it started, leaving only the sound of my own panic as I ran back to the track. As I ran along the trail, the feeling of being followed became unbearable. I didn't hear footsteps, but it was as if something invisible was right behind me, following each movement. The backpack seemed heavier than before, and I could not get my shoe off my head. The idea of carrying that with me began to fill me with regret. When I finally got to the point where I had parked the car, I realized something was wrong. The driver's door, which I was sure to have locked, was open. The interior was intact, but the bench was wet, as if someone had been there wet. I stood still for a moment, not knowing what to do, but the desire to leave spoke louder. I got in the car, threw the backpack on the back seat, and started the engine. The road back seemed longer, and at each turn I looked in the rear view mirror, convinced that I would see something following me. It was only when I got home that I realized the real problem. When I opened my backpack to take off my shoe, he wasn't there anymore. In his place there was a pair of small footprints made with something moist, marking the lining's fabric. My whole body froze. The shoe had simply disappeared, but the marks were there, as a reminder that I should never have touched it. I spent the rest of the night without sleep, trying to understand what happened. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what I brought with me that afternoon, but sometimes at night I hear the same whispers coming from somewhere inside the house. And on quieter nights, I'm sure they're calling my name.